there's no formula that's going to be perfect and you follow it. I think you're constantly creating the formula. Movement is always a big part of everything for me. There's sort of like a lack of permanence and a constant momentum, which I think is one of the great things about being a costume designer.
Donna Zakowska is a very important name in costume design. She has an incredible career, designing costumes for Mick Jagger, the Big Apple Circus, Woody Allen, and recently the great show The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel that got her several awards, including an Emmy. Donna, I'm very honored to have you as my guest for the 10th episode of Profession Costumière. Welcome. So I'd like to start with some questions about your early career, if it's okay with you. And to ask you how you became a costume designer, what led you to this profession? I've read that you first got into costume design by working for the Big Apple Circus.
In a way, that was, one of the first things that I actually did. Although I did go to the Yale School of Drama, and where I was trained as a set and costume designer, my early training was training in dance and in painting. I don't know if you knew this, I went to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris.
I didn't.
And yes, right after I graduated from Barnard College, Columbia University in New York, I went to the Beaux-Arts in Paris and spent a little bit over a year there studying painting. So all of my background has really very much been sort of dance and painting combined. And then the first really professional thing I did was, working on Woody Allen films and the Big Apple Circus. But the background was really as a fine artist and a tremendous amount of experience as a dancer. And I actually studied with Etienne Decroux in Paris. So it was, quite a varied, background, but it sort of explains my interest in movement and color and movement together.
Exactly, and we'll discuss that again when we'll talk about The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, because I guess it has been a lot of inspiration for you. And you mentioned Woody Allen, and so you were a costume designer assistant on several of his films, Shadows and Fog, Chris and Misdemeanors, and Alice. You were assisting Jeffrey Cullen, who designed costumes for many Woody Allen films, and later on films like Erin Brockovich, My Best Friend's Wedding, Ocean's 11, Inception. So can you tell us a bit how it was to work on those Woody Allen movies and to collaborate with Jeffrey Cullen?
Well, it was actually a fantastic way to start your career because in a way you're like dealing with someone who was really an auteur and really someone who, Woody Allen loved film, understood film. And he was actually very inclusive with me and allowed me to, go to the editing room every night. And so I would go there with Jeff Curlin and we would, after a day's work, sit there and watch the cuts and watch the dailies. And I really learned a lot about the camera. The camera sees, form and color. Of course, now it's digital, but it's still allow me to not just see things with my eyes, but to see things with the camera. And by being included to that degree in the making of films and the editing process, having just left school, it had an incredible impact on my career and also my knowledge of filmmaking and images on film.
Yes, it must have been a very incredible experience. Was there one of those three movies that you liked working on best?
Well, I think Crimes and Misdemeanors was sort of an incredible experience. Because it was very intense. I think it's sort of an amazing film. It was really, in a way, my first big film that I'd worked on. And it was such a New York experience, spending all that time at the Waldorf Astoria. And somehow it's when I really made my first contact with Woody and really spent a lot of time with him, actually. So it was a little bit like working and learning at the same time. And it was very intense, the whole experience. And I think it really, from that point on, I knew I would, really always want to deal with film to a degree, whether on television or, film per se, that I really loved the two-dimensional image, the whole magic of the camera.
And I also read on Wikipedia that you designed Mick Jagger's costumes for a tour. So can you tell us a bit about this experience, designing clothes for a style icon?
Yeah, well, that was also one of the, I think, sort of amazing experiences, because again, I had it was a whole long interview process. I never met him. I would send sketches in, and then one day, I was just called for a meeting uptown, and I walked into Mick Jagger's house, and he was there, and he just said to his children, "Oh, this is the person who's designing our costumes." And it was I really felt like the room was sort of moving around me. I thought, this is incredible. I'm like here with Mick Jagger. It was fantastic, and a lot of what I did was very unique, creating very unique pieces. He's an incredibly knowledgeable person in terms of clothing, because he's obviously always been conscious of it. So in the end, the things that were the most successful were the pieces that I did hand painting on, and all sorts of very individualized work. But there's no question he's like one of the greats, because his energy level, his whole way he approaches his work. I mean, you realize this is a unique person you're working with, and and it was certainly a very special experience for me.
How many costumes would you say you designed for him for the tour?
It was a few, quite probably somewhere around 40 costumes for him to 50. And then there was the whole band. So it was a fairly large design project.
What an experience.
Yes, it really was. Again, I was really quite young. And so it was really like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this,
And to discuss about the Marvel's Mrs. Maisel, so you're the costume designer of this TV show, and your splendid work got you many nominations and awards, such as Emmy Awards and Costume Designers Guild Award. So could you first tell us how you got on board of this project?
Well, it was one of those things. I was called for a meeting, and I met Amy and Dan Palladino.
Yes.
And with a sort of instant chemistry. And before I actually even made it down the elevator, I got a call from my agent, and they said, they really want you to do this.
Oh.
So it was one of these, like, again, it's always so much about chemistry. It was just like a sort of very instant chemistry. And I think what we had in common was a love of New York. Certainly a way of wanting to do this period that was, sort of an exciting way of doing it, because it was such a great time in New York City. And somehow we just, immediately connected. And it, was just great chemistry from that point on, and of course it's been, really great working with them on this.
And you were talking about how you were initially trained as a painter and a dancer. And in the interviews I saw you made about Mrs. Maisel, you said that this really helped you working on the costumes. So could you explain us a little bit how your relationship to color and movement inspired you for the creation of the costumes?
Well, I think that, movement is always a big part of everything for me. The way fabric moves. And that, comes from my sort of theatrical love of dance. Having done a lot of dance myself, it's just a sensitivity that I tend to apply to the costumes. And then the color, really since I was practically 5 years old, I was in crazy Catholic school with a nun who just loved painting. And so she really obsessed on what she thought was my ability with color. And so I had this like really, really early training, of working with color and, sort of mixing colors. And it's really stayed with me. I mean, I just get very excited by color. So I really, in a way, that combined with the movement is really the way I sort of tend to see costumes. I see them, in terms of how will they be animated, how does light work with them? What there are a lot of factors that actually go into making, I think, a costume seem very alive. And I love working, with those elements. So you're sort of inevitably a part of my psyche. It's not something I even have to like look. It's just who I am, I think.
And I saw also a video of you at the Emmys where you said that there's no end to the research that you're doing in your job in general and also in Mrs. Maisel. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your inspirations designing Mrs. Maisel's costumes. I guess there are many.
Yes, there are, and it's true that every time you approach a new costume or a new episode, it seems like there's always like new research to be done. Somehow it's like a whole new world that you have to enter, and so I work a lot. I know in our studio, we before I even know what we're exactly doing, like we set up these boards, all of these research boards, and sort of fill the walls with them. And then I have a certain amount of, inspiration by my desk. Sometimes it really comes from, strange pictures of like flowers or beautiful images of nature. And somehow they sort of connect to me in terms of like hats or like, oh, what if the dress had this tonality? And then of course, period magazines. I always sort of mention French Vogues because they have been in many ways like from that period, 57 to 60 have been very, sort of important to me in terms of really discovering what was exciting. I mean, I don't think until I designed Mrs. Maisel, although I knew it, I didn't quite understand the level of couture, the Dior and Jacques Fath and the level that was what was going on in clothing, especially in Paris between 57 and 62 was really one of the most amazing periods in women's clothing. So, really rediscovering that in a very big way. And the French Vogues were really like a wonderful source for me because they inevitably influenced American fashion, but they, especially New York, which is a little bit closer to Europe, but it was sort of really combining those magazines, the photographs from the period, and then just random type of research that I enjoy doing, in which color and texture are a big part of it.
And you also mentioned that you are a New Yorker, and I read in interviews that you were quite excited about this New Yorker plot. So could you tell us how your relationship with the city inspired also your work on The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel?
Well, I think what inspired me is that although I didn't quite experience it fully, that, the late 50s into the 60s was, when you really do your research, a very, very amazing time in New York City. And it was really a time where there was this tremendous amount of European influence. The city was, very, very much more, and this is what, tried to investigate, divided between uptown and downtown. So there was a lot of diversity, but it also was a place and a time where music and painting and politics really like worked hand in hand, in a way that I think they don't quite now. I feel things are much more separate.
Yes.
And so it was very exciting, for me to capture that moment in time when you have like a Jackson Pollock and, you have all of these, sort of folk singers and all of these things happening. I think it was a very, very vital time for New York City.
And it really shows in the TV show.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear.
And the actress Rachel Brosnan, who plays the main character, says a lot of wonderful things about you in the interviews I saw. And she also says that her character clothes are her armor, how she presents her inner life to the outside world, and that you understood that very intimately. So how do you feel about clothes being one's armor?
Yeah, I think Midge Maisel is a very presentational character, and it's very important to her. She is someone who, like, her clothing really are very connected to how she interacts with the outside world. And I know our director, like in the very beginning, had said she should never seem depressed, which isn't meant to say that she isn't. So I think we really sort of developed this look and this feeling of presentational clothing that really became like the emotional strand through, the character. And Rachel, who was very, very easy, I found, to collaborate with, we really sort of like immediately sort of understood who Midge was. We'd always say, oh, that's very Midge, or I don't think Midge would do that. It's like we both were sort of living the Midge Maisel reality, and somehow very much the same. We understood it in the same way, and so that's what really was enabled me to be able to even create so much clothing. And she's a very good animator of clothing, so I really was sort of able to give her all of these like crazy handbags and hats, and she really knew how to work with them, which is not always the case. That is, so it's not a given when you give an actor a prop or an accessory,
yes,
that they actually will be able to deal with it. So she's really a master at doing that.
I also have some extra questions about costumes. For instance, I was wondering if there's some movies or TV costumes that you like the most and that inspire you.
Well, I don't know if TV. I mean, I think it's more like designers. Like, I was always very inspired by Milena Canonero.
Yes.
I loved Barry Lyndon and that, the beauty of that palette. Before I did, now the 50s seems like my period, but before that I did, the 18th century. And did a lot. Well, because I had won an Emmy, for John Adams.
Yes.
And so those early, designs of Milena's were very influential. Certainly, Italian designers like Gabriele Pascucci, really, that really was work I looked at quite a lot, and also, early Italian films like The Conformist and The Leopard.
Yes.
Even though they may not be your period, when you look at those clothes and the way they're crafted and how exciting it is. I mean, that is always a big point to me, that when you see the costume, that, you really seduce people a little with it. And so I've always sort of loved that approach, and like those designers, Dotella Donati, that really have always, are incredible at doing that.
And is there a specific costume that you have designed and that you especially like?
That's a little bit hard. I don't know. I mean, I always feel like I'm a little bit in the moment.
Yes.
I've enjoyed, Midge Maisel's clothes as a whole.
Yes.
Because I really sort of tracked it color-wise. I always say, like, I sort of create this landscape, this map of color. And so that has been a great deal of fun for me doing that. And when I did John Adams, really delving into like particularly the French court in the 18th century, all crazy clothes. I really, really love doing that a lot. So I do love when there's this sort of theatrical element to the clothes. I mean, it's always great to be able to do real and credible, but my nature is always to slightly love, and I think starting in circus, would be a good example of that, to love the heightened or theatrical quality in costumes, but still credible. There's still credibility,
yes,
in the heightened nature of them.
What do you like the most about your job?
I think, in a funny way, it's probably first the research, that sort of period where you don't really have to produce anything. And all you have to do is like look at images and think and place yourself in these different. I love going into all these different worlds. I mean, what has been nice about Mrs. Maisel is that there's a tremendous amount of variety, and going to different places. Without question, I will say, being in Paris was like the height for me. That episode was something I actually wished for, and I had kept saying to Amy, couldn't we go to Paris? I mean, wouldn't it be? And then they called me, a few months later and said, oh, you were going to Paris. And so, that's the sort of thing, the traveling, the different worlds, there's sort of like a lack of permanence and a constant momentum, which I think is one of the great things about being a costume designer. It's not predictable. And you yourself always have to challenge yourself, there's no formula that's going to be perfect and you follow it. I think you're constantly creating the formula.
Is there a type of project, maybe films, TV, or anything else you would really like to work on, and why?
Well, I'd love to, there's so many things. I mean, I've never done like sort of a more science fiction type of thing that was heightened fantasy. I would love to do something like that. And I've also would like to do some very, earlier periods, really more like 17th or 16th century. It's not something that happens a lot in America. The one thing about being in America is, our history started so much later than yours.
Yes.
If you're going to do one of those things, you obviously have to be doing a project which is geared a bit more to Europe or another part of the world. But I'd love to do some of those really early periods. I think that would be incredible.
Well, thank you so much, Donna. I have asked all my questions. Is there anything more you'd like to add, or?
No, not really. I'm just, want to say how much I love France, and whenever whenever we do get to work there, it's always like my favorite thing. So anyway,
very nice to hear.
I'd like to thank Donna Zakowska for sharing her marvelous journey through costumes. To see the different clothes we've discussed, visit Profession Costumière on Instagram @ProfessionCostumière. See you soon for a new episode. Bye!